Good evening and welcome to this final session of the day. My name is Adam Chapman and I am a lecturer in medieval history at the University of London Institute of Historical Research, and I am chairing this session. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and as such, I ask you to keep your microphones on mute. You can turn your cameras on if you so wish, but be aware that your face will appear in the recording. And if you're not comfortable with that, leave it off. Firstly, I'd like to apologise on behalf of Vicky McCann, who is supposed to be with us this evening. Unfortunately, she's been taken ill and thus will not be able to join us. That said, our other speaker, Jack Southern, has very kindly agreed to give her presentation as well as his own, which is incredibly noble and possibly somewhat foolish of him. We shall see. I can see there's still a couple of people joining, so we're just going to wait for a second or two. As ever, thank you for your time. What happens in virtual seminars, as I'm sure you're aware, is exactly the same as happens in real life, that as soon as you start, more people will turn up. That said, it's now 17:32. We've only got an hour. And so we should probably get underway. So our first speaker, and indeed our second speaker, is Jack Southern, who's lecturer in history at the University of Central Lancashire up in Preston. Jack is going to give two talks, as I've alluded to already, one in the guise of Vicky McCann, who's archivist at Lancaster Archives, and one in his own right. Which one are you doing first, Jack?
I'll do the Lancashire Archives one to contextualise.
Marvellous, that makes sense. Okay, and the third talk in this session will be by me introducing the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community at the Institute of Historical Research and its many and varied projects. So without further ado, there will be time for questions at the end, I promise, and you can either ask those in the chat or on screen if you are willing. Meantime, over to Jack.
Thank you, Adam. Right, I will just hit slideshow on this. As Adam explained, I'm not Vicky McCann, nor do I work at the Lancashire Archives, although whilst undertaking my PhD many moons ago now, it feels like many moons ago now, I effectively lived there for a period. So I can talk a little bit about some of the collections and records that are there, and more broadly about regional archives in general. Regional archives, for those of you that may be at the start of doing your research or maybe aren't experienced it, regional archives are a fantastic resource that can be used in combination with some of the bigger archives around the country. And in the case of Lancashire Archives, don't just focus on Lancashire, but they also focus on Lancashire's relationship to other places, both within Britain and around the world as well. So they're a fantastic resource to tap into all sorts of different issues from different perspectives as well. In the second talk, I'm going to look specifically at some of my research and how I've used the archives for particular elements of local history as well. So the Lancashire Archives, as with many regional archives, houses the archives that are created by an organisation or individual in the course of transcribing its business, which are preserved as a record of that organisation or person. The Lancashire Archives has 9 miles of shelving full of the raw materials of history, a lot of it unexplored, and especially, I would say, unexploited. If any of you do ever decide to visit Lancashire Archives, if you ask kindly, they sometimes give you a tour of the shelves, but that kind of translates to something around 1.5 million documents that they house there as well. As I say, it tends to be unexploited, or at least underexploited by historians around the country, because it has all sorts of different things in there. Lancashire, especially through the industrial period, was a place of sizable towns and sizable industries. In the second talk, I'll kind of specifically focus on the cotton industry, but fishing, cotton, coal, and various other industries as well, all have records housed in Lancashire Archives that speak to both industries, Britain more generally, but also to other places as we go through as well. As well as 9 centuries Lancashire's past, place and people, social and economic history. The oldest document at the archives, if I am correct in this, and I'm almost certain that I am, dates back to the 12th century. But that translates to particular towns' records in various different ways. So, for example, something like Preston, the town which I am speaking to you from now, has a guild, as many towns around the country, but they have the complete record of the guild from 1397 or 1992, or close to the complete record of that. That allows you to dip in and out of different time periods and different themes as well, which is really, really useful to look into these in different aspects and different ways. They have a series of public records, which includes hospitals, quarters, sessions, courts, coroners, shipping enclosure, and the National Coal Board. Now, again, with these, they speak to much broader, wider national and international issues. For example, the hospital records, we have records of I feel like I work there now giving this talk. They have records of the asylums. For example, Whittingham Asylum was one of the largest in the country, housed just outside of Preston. The records for that, amongst various other things, has 15,000 of the inmates' records are held in the Lancashire Archives as well. You also, the quarter sessions are very important. The coroner's reports are really, really significantly interesting, especially for studying local history, to study the health and population, and to get the personal insights of some of the local health boards as well is really important. Shipping is especially an interesting one due to the location of Fleetwood, which is a town on the Fylde coast, which was a leading fishing town, later was involved in the Cod Wars in the 1970s, amongst various other businesses being related to coming in and out of Fleetwood as well. Obviously, older records, things like enclosure, and then also industrial records like the National Coal Board, which includes some really, really detailed reports on towns, not just in Lancashire, but in other places as well, which gives you a really good insight into conditions and thoughts and feelings across significant events. There's also a range of ecclesiastical and church records to look at: Anglican, Roman Catholic, nonconformist, tithe and probate. Now, obviously, those of you interested in architecture will find something there, but also those people interested, again, in the social and cultural history, things like naming patterns, births, marriages, baptisms, locations, numbers of these as well, especially with the nonconformists. Myself, I've used quite a lot of the nonconformist records, and some of their additional ephemera, such as annuals, publications, books, where they give you specific details about communities and nonconformist groups around different places, as well as key figures. All of this can be used in combination. You can link these up to business records. You can link these up to sometimes even the health records as well, to really study a place in depth and in detail. There's also official records from local authorities. As I said, Lancashire was very big. Some of the records have now gone to the Greater Manchester and Cumbria archives, but there are still records related to those places as well on there. The police staff records are a fascinating example that's still in the process of being digitized, but some of that is available online as well to look at the records of policing. That includes service records, but also some really interesting tidbits. One particular one that I've used in the past is the diary of the police chief of Burnley. Now that sounds boring, I know, but some of the details in that include their tactics that they used to monitor the communists in the town in the 1930s. And it has some very good detailed records of local communist activity, local communist meetings that you perhaps wouldn't find in other places, and especially won't always be in the kind of central files as well. You've also got school records and Poor Law Guardian records as well. Later records for more modern kind of historians, if you're interested in stuff like Newtown initiatives, you can follow through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the attempts to redevelop towns across Lancashire and the things that they did. Some of those include visits to other countries. Again, I was looking a few weeks ago at visits by people for Preston, Central Lancashire, Newtown, and their trip to the USSR on a fact-finding mission in terms of planning new towns and stuff. So there's all sorts of records that come in from official local authority ones as well. There's also a range of privately deposited collections, and that also relates to families and estates across Lancashire and the north of England. businesses, societies, charities, trade unions, which is one that I particularly use, but also employees associations. Some of these date back to the 17th century, especially with a vast array of diaries and journals that are held. I think there's one related to the Worden family that has a first-hand account of the discovery of the gunpowder plot, for example, held in Lancashire. But then you also have things like diaries of people travelling around Britain at certain particular time periods. I think they date from the 17th century, go right up to the present day. But again, like I say, around the country and also abroad, people's reflections, they include military diaries from campaigns abroad. They include businessmen's diaries and journals, going and exploring other places, all sorts in there. But these are really, really useful for historians of localities to really kind of dig down into the everyday lives of people, the thoughts and the feelings and their reflections as well. Really, really useful to work through. There's lots of other organisations held relating to Lancashire specifically, universities and colleges, businesses, Barclays and some of the other banks that related to him, although Barclays have a wonderful collection over in Manchester themselves, which is fantastic. Booths, which is kind of, for those of you who've never been to the north, is kind of like the Northern Waitrose. British Gas, as well as various private estates. Obviously, some landholders in Lancashire also held land in other parts of the country, so they can be used for that. And also links into stuff like National Archives, British Libraries, charities and schools as well. By bringing those together, you can use some of the local sources, local studies in Lancashire Archives with some of these things held in other places. And Adam's going to talk about some of those later as well. Access to the archives is fairly straightforward. If you've never been to one before, you need the archives visiting card, although they can do it. It's always worth emailing questions in advance, and they can arrange that. Also, the usual kind of restrictions apply in terms of pencils, laptops, photography, and stuff like that. Lancashire Archives is very easy to get to. It's basically across the road from Preston train station, which is a very well-connected train station as well, and in the centre of town, for those of you that do want to go there. I think the point that Vicky usually stresses when she delivers this is the key to getting the most out of visiting a local archive is to speak to the archivists. They are the experts in what they have. They are the experts in this. Use them and speak to them. A lot of the times they've created guides. Lancashire Archives has all sorts of guides, both on particular towns and on particular themes that they can tell you across collections, and also in collections held in other places as well that link into those. But send emails, speak to the archivists, get that advice as well. Archivists are very, very busy all the time, but most of the time they have that opportunity to speak to someone and help them and help them develop their research as well. Is always something that they enjoy doing as they go through. These are some of the potential difficulties to think about when using some of these sources. I think they apply to most people interested in history in terms of language, handwriting, formats, condition. I found the other day when I was preparing for this talk that a collection that I'd used in the past, I went to kind of look at, and it had gone missing in the last 6 months. So that's always a problem to have. They are on the case and they are trying to find it. But that is also something to bear in mind in terms of the access as well. Okay, if you want to search Lancashire Archives, they've got a wonderful search engine available now, lancashire.gov.uk/archives. You can also access various specific collections from there. For example, the Red Rose collection, which was a bringing together of various library collections as well. You can also email things over to them at the archives at lancashire.gov.uk as well. And I'm also happy to answer questions to the very best of my ability on the Lancashire Archives as well. But there's a location next to the train station as well. Okay, I should stop sharing that.
Right. Thank you very much, Jack. And what he said about the Lancashire Archives applies really in large part to archives in every local authority area. I've got to be careful not to say county, across not only England, but Wales and Scotland as well. And that point about talking to the archivists is essential. They know what they're doing. They're more than happy to tell you when you're getting it wrong. So we're now going to hand over to Jack to do his presentation, which should hopefully be a little less fraught for him. And do you have a presentation for this one as well, Jack?
I do, yeah.
Right, marvelous. Well, let's get on and share that, and I will hide myself away until.
Right, there we go. So let me just start this one. So obviously, as I said at the start, that would have been a kind of really polished delivery from the Lancashire Archives, and then I'd have just kind of swanned in at the end and just spoken about my research, and it would have all been seamless. Instead, you've been treated to a whistle-stop tour of the Lancashire Archives, and now my out of breath to this. So what I thought I'd do with this, following on from a kind of outline of what the Lancashire Archives has, is talk about my own experiences of using them for my own research. I primarily am a historian of the industrial north, specifically the Lancashire cotton industry as well, which means Lancashire Archives is fantastically well suited for what I'm looking into, alongside other archives around the county. But the way that I've used the archives to study local history is to kind of focus partially on industrial records, but to use them as a study of the localities rather than of the industry itself. And what that enabled me to do, and continues to enable me to do, is find some really interesting insights into local life, local attitudes, and local cultures that perhaps have been overlooked in the past as well by other historians. This is just an example I included of the picture here of a Lancashire operative in 1842. I think it's quite an interesting image, and I chose it because whenever anyone talks about the Lancashire cotton industry, it's kind of synonymous with the idea of kind of weavers with shawls and clogs on from probably the 1860s, 70s, 60s, 70s onwards. That kind of image develops. But in the 1840s, you have this sketch, and this sketch was actually done in the 1860s or 70s, but it's a really interesting kind of example of that local nuance of what a Lancashire cotton operative looked like in the 1840s. So for a bit of background then, my PhD research was an examination of the relationship between community and industry, focused primarily on North East Lancashire, which is this bit in the top right corner up here. I might be blocking it out of my own face. Oh, there we go. This bit, I don't know why it's changing like that. This bit here in the top right corner up here. And the point of it was, and I was funded by Lancashire Museums on this, with a heritage site, an industrial museum. And the point of it was to move beyond the generalisation of the Lancashire cotton industry. As I kind of outlined with the Lancashire Archives, Lancashire was vast. It included Manchester and Liverpool during the industrial period, as well as bits of Cumbria and bits of Yorkshire as well. What is now Yorkshire anyway, disputed point, I know. But it was vast. So to really understand the nuances of the locality and to really dig into the specific area, which was this northeast bit that encompasses Burnley, Nelson and Colne. So the need for me was to look at local history research approaches and sources, but also to find ways of drawing out some of those local nuances. So my starting point at the very beginning of this journey I went on was to try and understand the cotton industry, to try and understand the localities that were linked to it, and to then move on to look at the macro and the micro level differences between them. Increasingly, as I continue to research this industry, is that there's so much difference even within kind of localities and towns and villages that are hundreds of yards apart in terms of the industrial and the social makeup of the towns and places and villages as well. One of the most important things to kind of emphasize with this is the significance of industry to towns during the industrial period, especially in places like the industrial north. Areas of the Midlands are much the same. London in parts is the same as well. The significance of industry to those places helps shape the character, helps shape other elements of the local history. If you're talking about local health and sanitation, for example, the towns of North East Lancashire, which is in that Clitheroe bit in the top right there, showed huge variance that was linked to the types of materials that they wove, the periods that the industry started, for example. I think Burnley and Nelson are two very similar towns, about 6 miles between them. But Burnley actually had nearly double infant mortality rates for a period in the early to mid 1900s. on a superficial level, they were doing the same industries, it was the same makeup, but because of digging into some of those industrial differences locally, you can start to pull out some of those threads as well. Just for a comparison of the size of this and the kind of difficulties it had at the start, back in 1921, there was circa 570,000 people employed in the cotton industry alone. So it was a big industry. And a lot of these towns, well, Burnley especially, Blackburn, had a population of over 100,000 people as well. So these were big places with a lot of difference in them. A starting point for this is to look at the geography of places. Obviously, British History Online, Vision of Britain, Victoria County History, EFOS, former thesis search as well is always a great resources. I think I mentioned in the talk earlier, local libraries is an often overlooked resource because a lot of their stuff should have gone to archives, but didn't. So you can often find some very rare things in local libraries that they shouldn't have anymore. I found some tremendous stuff that should have gone to the Lancashire Archives. And they, in fact, thought they had at some points. But local libraries are a great place to start there as well, and have tremendously knowledgeable staff to help with different elements of geography and background as well. Obviously, archives, some of the things I mentioned in the earlier talk, but also antiquarian books and collections held, obviously the IHR and the linked archives to it has a tremendous array of that, but in other places as well, great selection of antiquarian books. A lot of these are increasingly being digitized both by Google Books and the Internet Archive, the online Internet Archive. Tremendously useful for background and understanding places as well, and looking at local societies. And on the point of local societies, the talk earlier I gave was about the British Association of Local History. I have been lucky enough to work with a number of local history societies, and they have had sources and collections which are absolutely unbelievable. So sometimes reaching out to some of those groups that have personal private collections is a really, really useful thing. I mean, I found minute books from mills that kind of in the early 19th century and stuff like that, which just wouldn't be able to find in other places as well. The book that's on there is one of my favourites, by the way, which was an antiquarian book and was reprinted as well by Abraham Newell, just as an example. And the main thing I want to talk about just for the rest of this talk is organisational records and their use for local history. I apologise for the poor quality resolution of this, but I couldn't find a better quality one as well. The Weavers Association was the cotton operatives, the cotton weavers, cotton operatives trade union for the majority of the period. It was one of the biggest unions in the country, primarily a female membership as well because of the nature of the cotton industry. So their records give a tremendously detailed and nuanced angle to local studies and local history. They cover topics, subjects, and have voices of a number of women where in periods before that was kind of really well accepted in a number of different industries and places as well. Another kind of interesting element to this is that they had a federal system. So although they have central files related to the Weavers amalgamation, you also have local branches that deal with local issues. So in 1921, they had a membership of 224,000, just over 224,000. In some towns, they had over 90% density in the sense that the people that worked in the cotton industry in that town were union members. Now, they deal with industry, they deal with health and social care, they deal with various other elements for it as well. They even work on international relations. The last week I've been looking at records where they were doing missions to the USSR and East Germany from the 50s until the 70s to go and observe workers and mills and factories in different countries over there. They didn't enjoy Moscow, but they really enjoyed Tbilisi. I can tell you that. But there's trips to America, there's trips to India. They also hosted foreign dignitaries, Japan, India, America again as well. So you have all these different elements of them coming into the locality, how these places responded to it, how they acted, how they saw themselves as well. The Weavers Association especially also has their own departments of statistical departments and researchers. So you have detailed research, detailed statistics, covering elements of towns and in some cases villages. And what that does is it gives you a wide range of materials to offer vignettes into local life between the 1880s and 1980s as well, both within Lancashire and outside of it. At an amalgamation level, it's initially quite daunting. You've got correspondence, circulars, working files, all linked to local issues. You've also got some of those issues I mentioned earlier, the wider world. You can see kind of just the start of the tree here, and how that breaks down to different elements as well. But there's all sorts in there, and it's really, really interesting, the things you can find in there. So some of the examples are some of the things that might be of interest. On something like working conditions, you've got interviews, surveys, reports, studying and examining health and safety in mills. But there's also different things in there, things such as gender, dialect, working patterns. This is a report from, I think, 1888 into the conditions of steaming in weaving sheds. And what that meant was the creation of artificial humidity. You need it to be damp and hot, basically, to weave cotton. So they used to pump or steam the weaving mills. This is a huge collection of oral interviews in Blackburn, conducted in 1888 by local. On the right-hand side was with Jane Ann Dawson, examined by the chairman. She gives her address, her employee. She goes into detail about the work. She goes into detail about various things. This is hundreds and hundreds of pages of these oral interviews. It gives you a really in-depth look of social conditions, working conditions, even gender conditions within Blackburn in 1888 as well. And Blackburn was a sizable town. You also have an array of correspondence, relationship between the local and national. This is from all sorts of other industries, politicians, political parties. It's a wide range of correspondence that comes in. This is an example of the Daily Herald newspaper in London writing to the Weavers Amalgamation to talk about sending an industrial correspondent up to study a lockout that happened in 1930, well, started in 1929, but continued into 1932 as well. You can pull out all sorts of relations with political movements across the country, but also across the world for this as well. And some of the things referred to in these files linked to wider organisations like Trade Union Congress, and are copies of some of the things that they've sent out as well. So some of it is quite rare to get to as well. There's also links, though, to social and cultural history and leisure. This, for example, here is an advertisement to try and convince the cotton operatives in 1929 to stop going to Blackpool, which was the kind of favoured holiday destination for them, and to maybe go over to Ireland, well, the Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, as it says here as well. You can see it gives you a detailed kind of outline of what the tour would entail over there, leaving from Heysham, which is on the coast of Lancashire as well. But there's all sorts of elements to this as well in the leisure and education. You have movements, you have records, you have interviews, again, correspondence that links to all these different elements of working class social life as well. You also have other elements of ephemera. This was a newspaper that the Burnley weavers from their federated collection as well. They started their own newspaper, partly out of jealousy for the neighbouring town of Nelson starting their own newspaper for the weaving operatives. But again, this includes images. As part of these wider collections, it includes oral history recordings, it includes writings, it includes sometimes sketches, poetry. There's a fantastic collection of, there was a prize competition held for children to write essays about where they were from, and they have hundreds and hundreds of entries every year, and these are all held in these collections as well, where you can really pick out different elements of local life. You also can pull out various different elements of it through disputes for which the Weavers Amalgamation was central to. These are both local but industry-wide, and they show local variations in there, but also include politicians, courts, and various other elements to it. This is an excerpt from probably my favourite, and this is kind of really geeky of me, isn't it? I have a favourite archival source that I'm currently working on at the moment. But this is a court case where the Weavers Amalgamation took a series of employers and villages around Lancashire to court for their refusal to adhere to wage principles. Now that sounds very, very boring in 1920. Sounds very, very boring. But what happened was basically a group of the employers got together in these villages that spread across Lancashire, right from the kind of north to the south. And they argued with the Weavers' Amalgamation about how they were different and special. So what you get is this in-depth argument and discussion about the differences between industrial towns and industrial villages, where they quote kind of working numbers, they quote culture, they quote working practices. I mean, some of it's absolutely fantastic. They get into this kind of debate about how one mill that's outside in the country can't recruit good weavers because it's up a steep hill and they can't find anyone that's willing to walk up the steep hill for the wages they offer. Now, that sounds quite trivial and pulled out, but if you're looking into local history, these local kind of vignettes, they offer so much depth into working practices. So we can look into then the kind of makeup and differences of working places. We can link that to wages. We can link that to output. Some of these mills that survive, some of these mills that decline. We can link it into wider historical debates. Some of these places suffer because of the roads and their distance away from trains. We can start to chart the switchover from rail transportation to car and motor car and the transitions there as well. We can chart later on through this, you can start to chart elements of immigration into the Lancashire cotton industry through this as well. So these industrial records on the front kind of people maybe sometimes think that they predominantly look at just an industry, but they don't, because that relationship between the town and the industry, the local and the industry, is really, really significant and is really, really important and a rich place to look as well. So where to go? Obviously, there's specific collections. Warwick, the People's History Museum. Warwick has special collections of industry. The People's History Museum, the Working Class Movement Library, both in Salford. The John Rylands as well for the cotton industry. But this is attributable to other industries as well, if you're interested in doing this. Local archives combined with organisational records. And like I say, it's been a kind of focus case study here, but this is a really interesting way, I think, of engaging with local history and really drawing out some of the nuances of it as well. If anyone has any questions about what I've said, or the cotton industry, or Lancashire even, please feel free to email me, and obviously I'll take questions at the end as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you once again, Jack. That was really a tour de force, really. Enormous amount of information in a very short period of time. Don't forget, we are recording this session, so if you want to listen back, you can. And there will be time for questions at the end. So without further ado, I shall go on to my own presentation. If I can get share screen to play ball. There we go. Yes. Slideshow. Hang on. It's hiding the button that tells me how to share the screen. That's helpful. I know. Right, every presenter's nightmare. Okay, thank you for your patience. My name is Adam Chapman, and I am lecturer in history at the Institute of Medieval History at the Institute of Historical Research, and I'm a member of the Institute's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. And although I'm a lecturer in medieval history, I spend most of my time actually working on the Centre's projects, which is the Victoria County History of England, more of which I'll come to later. So what is the Centre? The Centre is set up to deal with placed histories, as we put it. So that is histories focused on place, using place as a means of investigation or organisation. We have expertise in urban, community and place-based histories. We have a huge amount of publishing experience and a range of publishing projects. A seminar, the People, Place and Community Seminar, which uses it as a forum to address any history that falls into those categories. So not only local histories, but more sort of theoretical constructs about what the idea of people or place or indeed community might mean. We have collaborations across heritage, archaeology and community histories, and a range of projects, some longer established than others. The Victoria County history I've mentioned, Layers of London, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and we even have a MOOC. That's a massive open access online course, which is called Applied Public History, Places, People and Stories, and more again of that in a moment. So let's start with my own project, which I am the series editor, the general editor, whatever you want to call it, which is the Victoria County History, which is probably the longest established local history project in the world. It was established in 1899, initially as a commercial project, the aim of which was to produce histories of every county in England. There were proposals to move into Wales in the early 1900s. These were not pursued due to, as is so often the case with local history, lack of funds. There are to date 243 of our big red books, which are histories mostly of places, what we call topographical volumes. So the aim of the project was to produce 2 introductory volumes for each county, and they might cover subjects as broad and diverse as archaeology in all its various forms, geology, flora and fauna and botany, which is actually still quite valuable. Those subjects were prepared by experts, many of the Natural History Museum. They recorded things like local names for our plants and animals. They recorded distribution of plants and animals by sort of density and frequency. And they're still be consulted by environmental scientists today, which is a matter that always surprises us. We're still going, we're still producing research in 14 different counties in England at the present time, which is the most since the First World War. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. We have an app, which is called A History of England's Places, English Places, sorry, which again is quite interesting, and we'll talk more. Enables you to take the histories in your smartphone or on your mobile device around the country and see what the history of the place you happen to be standing in actually was. There are a range of projects, which are many and various. There's more details on the website. I've provided Jenny with the links and included at the end of the presentation, and a range of community engagement activities, which stem from a early project called England's Past for Everyone. A lot of our histories are now produced by volunteers, or with volunteer contributions or volunteer input. We do have one of our big red books that's a history of, I think, 12 parishes in Nottinghamshire, which will be the first history published for that county since 1907, which is entirely volunteer produced, with some professional input, but most of what we'll publish will be the work of volunteers, and that is a heroic achievement, a colossal achievement from a very dedicated group of people. So those of you who are familiar with local history may have encountered our big red books. Ones I've illustrated here are Durham, which are generally give you a collection of parishes in a volume. I've often focused on a market town or a city and its surrounding area. We also produce what we call shorts, 18 to date, which are focused on individual places. They take the VCH approach, which is very, very heavily structured, very tightly focused on themes. And every volume we published will include a history of the land ownership, what we used to call the manorial descent. So who owns the land? And from that, you can find all sorts of different perspectives on history. You can find where else they owned land. You can find a sense of how much it was worth to them. Were they were the landowners actually resident in their community? So were the community shaped by the landowner, or did the landowner just take the rent? Those sorts of questions, good social economic history questions. We'll have a history of the Parish Church, which is particularly valuable for the earlier volumes, because you consider that if we're surveying these churches before a building before the First World War, it may not be there today. Indeed, there is one just south of Aylesbury, which has just been dug up by archaeologists in the path of HS2, but was at the time it was surveyed a standing building falling down, yes, but a standing building. So those things are actually a primary resource of what buildings and places were like at the 120, 100, or 100 years ago. We have histories of places like Welland and Letchworth, so part of the Garden City movement, which had not yet then been built. We have the new towns of Milton Keynes, of Stevenage, whose histories we have published, but the new towns, the place you see today, the place you get off the train and have a look at, is not the place that was there then. So you get a sense of where these places come from. The shorts are focused on individual places, as I say, and use the same approach. So as well as land ownership, they'll have an introductory section giving an overview of the place as it exists at the time of publication. It's another unique feature of the series. Social and economic history, giving you an overview. They're intended to be encyclopedic rather than definitive. There is always more you can say about any given place, but the series holds the view that all places are of interest and all places have a history worth recording and properly detailing based on primary resources, the kind of things that Jack's been talking about in local archives and national archives, in the archives of businesses and industries. All these things are used. So part of the purpose of the series is to bring together an overview, a detailed overview of what you could find in any given place. Of course, the histories of churches and religion, and also of local government. So one of the values of the project is that you look in the books, or you look at them online. Many are available on British History Online, and you can read their footnotes. Lots and lots and lots of footnotes using not only primary resources but secondary resources, the kind of publications put together by either very eminent historians, historians of industries, historians of individual people. It's of huge use to genealogists we discovered, and to house historians who are particularly keen on the work we produce, and indeed increasingly environmental historians, because things change. Places are affected by climate change and by flooding and by the way in which development has altered society and the landscape. One example of this is Milton Keynes, which when we got around to it in 1927, the fieldwork was probably done somewhat earlier, probably before the First World War, was a village in the middle of Buckinghamshire on a large flat plain, which was of very little consequence whatsoever, covered nearly 2,000 acres, and most of that was grass. You'll see in the picture in the corner is an excerpt from Helen Day's Ladybird book Twitter account, which describes the creation of new towns, one of which was Milton Keynes, and others include Havant, which we tackled in, I think, 1905, and Basingstoke, which we tackled in 1907. The Basingstoke example has been rebuilt 3 times since. The town you saw in 1907 is not the town you would see today. So we are revisiting some of these places, and Basingstoke is one. Milton Keynes, of course, has changed out of all recognition. It's now a city of nearly 1 million people, famous for roundabouts, which had not, when we did it, been devised or invented. As I say, many of our volumes, about 160, are on British History Online, which is an IHR site, under the secondary sources collection. And this is where they were viewed in 2019-2020. As you can see, pretty much anywhere with an internet connection, somebody has looked at a VCH text online. If you know anyone in Greenland, or indeed in Central Africa, who would be interested in English local history, would quite like to colour the map in properly. So do get in touch and ask to look at the web pages. Taking one of the advantages of being a project of such a long established tradition is that we have a vast back catalogue, and as I said, much of it's online, so different ways of reutilising that material, very much part of the centre's ethos, to take work and to look at it in a fresh, look at it in a different way, is one of those ways is through our app, which is called A History of English Places, and it's a collaboration with AIMA Media, and it's a free app which gives you a overview of geolocated first edition Ordnance Survey mapping from the second half of the 19th century. So the idea of the app is that if you load it onto your phone, you can go anywhere in the country, you can track where you are, and you can see what was on the ground probably 120, 150 years ago. And if we've published a history of it, you can read our history of that place, and you can see the history of the neighbouring places. One of the big limitations of using the volumes as hard books is that they are volumes, they're books, and thus if you are reading history of one place, the 3 neighbouring places might be in 3 different counties. Thank you for the comments on North Korea. Or in 4 different books. So for that point, so from that perspective, this is to broaden it out. So obviously we don't have universal coverage yet. We've covered about a third of the parishes in England to date. So where we don't have that coverage, then you'll find that we have entries from a 19th century geographical gazetteer, which is roughly the same date as them on the mapping, which gives you a sense of what you'd have seen at that point there. So it's free, it works on Android or Apple, and there are details in the link at the end. Doing the same sort of thing is a much more recent project funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and collaboration with the British Library, the Museum of London Archaeology, all 35 London boroughs, which is Layers of London. And the purpose of Layers of London is to enable us to take London's history, London in the broadest sense, including the bits which were in Surrey, were in Middlesex, were in Kent, and to overlay them to get, you can take a deep drill down through London's history from the Paleolithic in the form of a finds map from the Museum of London Archaeology unit, through 16th and 17th century London for the Historic Towns Trust, and through 16th and 17th century maps. The 18th and 19th century, you can see London expand, and you can through 19th century mapping and 20th century aerial photography, all the way up to the present day. Quite a lot of resources like this around Britain, and if you look online, you may find that your county has one. So for the western counties around Bristol, you can there is Know Your Place West, which includes Devon, Somerset, Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, all of Gloucester, Bristol itself, which can give you mapping from the tide maps in the 1830s all the way through to modern Ordnance Survey data, so you can see how things have changed and how things have developed over that time. All of Wales has its tide mapping available online, for example, so it's not just England. But what makes Layers of London different is that you can tag your own histories onto the map and explore that for a different fixed moment in time. So there are collections of data that people have put on of their own data, of data from local archives, arranged by theme. We have, among other things, Jewish London. We have a section, I think a selection of georeferenced to events. So the range of stuff on there is absolutely enormous, and gives you a real insight into the capital's history and the area around it. This builds on the expertise of the former Centre for Metropolitan History, which is now rolled into the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. I've mentioned events. Well, we have several. The most consistent event is the seminar, which I've mentioned before. We also have a range of supplementary projects, including what we call the what is known as "and towns," which is the cultural economies of recovery. So looking at how local history and place identity can inform how places can recover from the pandemic. We also have a range of online training, which was initially tailored for Victoria County history authors, but has a much wider relevance. So there are sections on understanding landscape and settlement analysis, a session on the medieval records held at the National Archives by the principal record specialist there, Paul Dryborough, which is, if you don't understand the Middle Ages, you don't understand the records, wouldn't know where to start, I recommend that. It's an hour of your time well spent, because Paul is fantastic. Cartography and mapping for publication, and many, many more. So the seminar contains topics as varied as seaside resorts, the architecture of prisons, and goodness knows what else. I'm co-convener of that, so if you have anything that you think would fit into that seminar, please drop me a line. I'd be delighted to hear from you. There are other sort of more creative ideas. We had, as part of the 120th anniversary of the foundation of the VCH, we had something called a Red Boxes Gallery. The idea of which was that you could take anything could fit in a red box file about the size of a red volume to illuminate and illustrate a history of each county, a history of your county. A gallery of some of those objects is available online, and you can take a look. This GIF, I've warned, contains flashing images, so look away now if you'd like to be offended by that. Perhaps the most radical thing we've done is our MOOC, which is Applied Public History, Places, People, Stories. And the idea of the MOOC, it's a free online course, which you can complete at your own rate. It's got some excellent reviews, is to look at how the sort of research ideas and research methodologies we use in our various projects can be employed to your locality, your set of local projects, your place, or to give you ideas about how you might want to pursue those histories yourself. Full of expertise from in public engagement, in historical research, in what local history is all about anyway, from our experts and from our team. I think there's an even interview with me 2 weeks post the birth of my son, and I may not be on the highest form. So I'll wrap up there. We have a range of links, which, as I say, I've shared with Jenny, and she will make sure are available elsewhere. If you'd like to follow any of the projects on Twitter, you can follow the centre at CHPPC_HR, the Victoria County History at VCH_London, or Layers London, which is at Layers of London. If you've got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you. So with my chair's hat on, are there any questions? Remember, you can either put them in the chat or you can use the raise hand function and ask them face to face. Yes, Christine, would you like to unmute yourself? Christiane, sorry. Could you unmute yourself, please, Christiane?
Yeah, thank you.
That's better, thank you.
It's not so much a question as a comment. One of the things that when I got back into doing local history a few years ago, I contacted various academics and I found them generally really helpful. And because often when you're doing local history, you're doing it on your own, and it's sometimes difficult. You're talking to archivists, you're talking to librarians, but it's still difficult to know exactly how it fits in with other things. So I'm very much an advocate of when you see articles by, and you know somebody's an expert, they're generally quite happy to respond. And yeah, so that really adds to the whole situation of trying to get into local history, in addition to what you've already been saying all day long. So, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's actually a really important point. Anyone who's published on history, on any sort of history, does like to know that people have read their stuff, and is generally very pleased to hear from anyone that has read their stuff and has more questions. They may not be able to answer them, but has more questions arising from them. Yeah, so that's a very important point. Yes. Any more questions? I can understand probably given the time of day, you're probably all yeah, right, wonderful. Any resources on Dorset? That's it comes up in the chat. What sort of resources do you want, I suppose, is the question. Most counties will have, in fact, all counties will maintain an historic environment record. The Dorset as currently constituted has a county record office in Dorchester, sorry, but parts of Dorset have their own unitary authority. So Poole has a separate archive, as I recall. I happen to know the former county archivist of Dorset, so if you'd like to drop me an email, adam.chapman I can put you in touch with them, and they will be able to answer any question on the county and its history you care to ask.
Yeah, I'd also say, obviously, I did the talk earlier about the British Association of Local History, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, about 8 different groups. In fact, no more than that. There's probably there's a lot of different local history groups. If you go on the BALH website, which is balh.org.uk, and you go to the Society Directory, which is in the top right corner, you'll find one for Dorset, and there's an array of different groups that are interested in various different things as well. And it might be worth maybe reaching out to them and seeing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Family history group. There's a Somerset and Dorset Family History Society, for example. There's Somerset Dorset Notes and Queries, which is who publish a journal. There's a Dorset Record Society as well, I remember rightly. I'm just trying to remember the ones off the top of my head. But it depends on your interest. It depends what you want to know. If you can ask me, if you, as I say, drop us a line, I can think of any number of specific answers to that question. But the general question is quite difficult because there's such a range of history out there. But yes, there's a good point in the chat about museums. Museums of any subject are interesting and valuable, which have their own historic collections as part of to support their physical object collections. And pretty much anything you can imagine, there is a museum devoted to it. And some of those are sort of national collections, and National Railway Museum is one. There is a bus archive which has records of bus companies all over the country, and includes its collections of a couple of 15th century deeds, which is not where you would expect to find a 15th century deed. But that's just one other. So that's just the transport. So those are the ones that come to mind. So I've been doing some transport history recently as part of the job. As a medievalist, working for the VCH has changed my perspective and appreciation for these things, because you end up starting from scratch every single day. So yes. Are there any further questions before we let you go and have your tea?
I think there's another comment about learning to love catalogues. I think I mentioned in my talk, a lot of archive collections and indeed museums have done extensive work on guides to kind of help you navigate their collections, and they're fantastic. I think I mentioned the Lancashire Archives ones, but they've got them for specific towns, so you can kind of look through it and see everything related to a specific town, and then particular themes as well, and they can make it a lot easier to navigate the search catalogues as well, to maybe look at the established guides that are already out there that the people have put together.
And do actually take, although it's the National Archives, do take a look at the National Archives website and their study guides and research guides, because they're first rate. And of course, because it's a National Archive, all local is national ultimately, or all national is local, whatever. And their research guides will give you information about how to research on any subject you can think of, and some that you can't, because they have records of locality, records of place. So for the last 200 years, the state has maintained an interest in what farmers have done, for example. So you want to find what crop was farmed in your parish and your place 200 years ago. The government knows, the government knew, and the records are at Kew. So National Archives, National Records are key to this as well. So, and also the research guides are very handy in telling you what they don't have at Kew and where you might find it elsewhere, which is they maintain the National Register of Archives too, which is an invaluable resource. So if you're looking for a business in your town or in your city, and you want to know what happened to its archive or where it is, it may not be in the place you think. So it's worth checking. The Youth Hostel Archive, for example, is the University of Birmingham. Again, another thing I stumbled across in the day job. So I could rabbit. I mean, Jack could rabbit on about different archives he's used. I could rabbit on about different archives I've used. But to give you a sense of the range of Victoria County History volume, we have references in a book I have going to press shortly everything from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to charters to King Alfred's will, to the archives of Butlins Limited, and many, all describing the same 4 miles of coast in West Somerset. So that the joy of local history is that you can go very deep, and you can cover all sorts of topics in a very narrow geographical space, and that's one of the things that's most exciting about it, and gets you to explore anything you want within the context of anywhere you happen to be. Okay, it's now half past 6. Acutely aware that it is someone's tea time somewhere, and that someone might be my 2-year-old, it might be me. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all our speakers today. I'd like to thank Jenny for organising this, and everyone who's attended, and Jack and Vicky who could not be here, and everybody else. Have a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.